Before starting any coding, it's always useful to write down exactly what you plan to do. This will allow you to get a rough idea of what you need to do and, more importantly, in what order. Imagine you are writing a cooking recipe. You have one part of your recipe that says fry beef. You don't say how to do it or what to fry it with, you are leaving that up to the individual cook. One cook might use a wok with some sesame oil, another a frying pan with vegetable oil. Both cooks will end up frying beef. How they do it is up to them. This is the idea behind pseudocode. It's a way of describing roughly what your program needs to do while leaving the actual code down to the specific language. Consider creating a variable in C#, VB.NET and Python. We will look at variables in more detail later on, but for now think of a variable as a bucket for storing data. In our case, we want to store a password. Variables need names, so we will call this one myPassword and give it a value of p@55word. To write this in pseudocode, we might write something like this. This is basically saying create a variable called myPassword and put the data p@55word in it. To write this code in C#, VB.NET and Python, we would need to write the following. You will see that although we are doing exactly the same thing, each language does it differently. This is where pseudocode is incredibly important, because it means we can focus on what the program is going to do rather than how we are going to actually code it. We have seen pseudocode previously. It is a form of almost code that can vary a lot depending on who is writing it. For example, the following 3 sets of pseudocode are identical. All 3 pieces of pseudocode do exactly the same thing. They declare a variable called user_input, stores whatever a user types into the console into it, and then outputs the result. However, they look quite different. This is one of the issues with pseudocode. It can vary between schools and even between teachers. This means you could be given an exam question in a form of pseudocode that you are not familiar with. To get around this problem, AQA have defined their own rules for pseudocode. It looks very similar to normal pseudocode, but it is a lot more formal in that it has absolutely defined ways of writing things that will not change between schools. This way everyone knows what to do. The English language is a formal language in that it has a defined set of rules that you must follow. For example, the formal rules for a complete sentence in English include: the first word must start with a capital letter, the sentence must end with a full stop. In your exam, you'll be expected to get the grammar and syntax of the AQA pseudocode as correct as possible. We'll be using pseudocode throughout the programming lessons later in this course, but let's have a look at some of the basics now. Variables are created by simply stating their name. Assigning a value to a variable uses the left arrow sign. Getting input from a user and storing in a variable uses the user_input command. Printing out to the console, displaying output to the user, uses the output command. Comments, little notes we add to explain our code, are written using a hash symbol. Let's look at a simple program to add up 2 numbers and look at this program line by line. Line 1, this is a comment. Comments don't actually do anything and are simply used by the programmer to remind them what a block of code does. Line 2 prompts the user to enter a value, and then line 3 declares a variable called number1 and stores the value input by the user. Line 4 prompts the user to enter a second value. Then line 5 declares a variable called number2 and stores the value input by the user. Line 6 declares a variable called result and then adds together the contents of the variables number1 and number2 and stores this in the result variable. Line 7 is where the result of the calculation is displayed to the user. So, programmers use pseudocode to show how their code is going to work. It is like a bullet-pointed list of how a program works. It is completely independent of any programming language. AQA pseudocode is very similar to other forms of pseudocode. It is more formal though, in that it has its own rules. You may be asked questions and asked to give answers in pseudocode. It allows for code comments as well as variable declarations, input and output. This is a paper-based language only, and there is no compiler.